Imagine this. A plane lands at Pyongyang Sunan Airport. The red carpet rolls out. The brass band has strangely been trained with hymns and gospel instead of national anthems. The welcoming crowd has been selected with care, with crying, cryptic, yet loyal North Korean Catholics shedding tears out of excitement. The door opens, and out comes the Pope. It sounds really ridiculous, doesn't it? Once upon a time, in the early 1990s, the world's most suspicious communist monarchy considered inviting the Pope to its capital. Not a metaphorical Pope. It was a real deal to invite the actual Pope John Paul II, the leader of the Catholic Church, to Pyongyang. For a brief period, North Korea, or at least Kim Il-sung, wanted His Holiness badly. Comrades, I am not kidding. The collapse of the Soviet Union was so devastating, and the kingdom practically lost all its socialist friends in the early 90s. The Czechoslovak Socialist Republic was dissolved into the capitalist Czech Republic and Slovakia. Russia and China established diplomatic ties with South Korea. The Kosovo War broke out. The NATO Air Force bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, and Bill Clinton didn't even give a shit about it. Uncle Sam was winning, undoubtedly and inevitably. North Korea was suddenly stuck in a diplomatic siege, and our great leader demanded a breakthrough. Kim Il-sung looked around and thought thoroughly about possible allies. What about the Pope? Pope John Paul II was the spiritual head of more than 1 billion believers, and his actual job was to visit different cities, shake hands with the head of the state, and make the crowd fill the street and weep uncontrollably. Did Kim make it happen? Unfortunately, no. But at least the North Korean Foreign Ministry tried very hard. We will get into the details later. In this episode, we dive deep into one of the strangest and most critical diplomatic pivots in North Korean history, when Pyongyang contacted the Vatican and decided to go to the United Nations hand in hand with South Korea. Kim Il-sung's reunification dream abruptly ended along with the Cold War. For the first time, the Kim regime grudgingly acknowledged South Korea, not as an American-occupied puppet state, but as a rival government sitting in the same international room, with its own flag, its own nameplate, and a richer economy that made Juche look like a failed electricity grid. 2 Koreas, 2 UN seats, and unfathomable emotional damage inside the great leader's heart. This is part 2 of our Korean reunification series. Again, before we begin, a salute to our channel members. Your support is our tiny studio's lifeline. You keep our lights on, the research going, and the sponsorship free. We wouldn't make it so far without your financial aid. Thank you, sincerely. Now, buckle up, let's begin.
Defining the Spirit campaign as the basic form of struggle for socialism and pushing forward all work like lightning, Kim Jong-il said. Accelerating socialist construction to the maximum by a powerful Spirit campaign is precisely the decisive guarantee for socialism to overwhelm capitalism imperialism.
It was 1991, and North Korea's world was collapsing in real time. The Berlin Wall had fallen. Eastern Europe had abandoned its communist parties with the speed of a family changing its surname after a national scandal. The Soviet Union, North Korea's great protector, was disintegrating from the inside. South Korea had established diplomatic relations with Moscow in 1990, and China, the last socialist big brother, still capable of sending fuel and food without asking too many questions, was decisively moving towards Seoul. For Pyongyang, it was suffocating. The so-called puppet South was collecting the friends North Korea used to depend on, like collecting stamps. Seoul had hosted the Olympics, built factories, exported cars, and somehow convinced the socialist camp that capability came with better international trade deals. The puppet regime had money, Moscow, and soon Beijing. For decades, Pyongyang was the one planning to absorb the South. But now the position was reversed. Soviet support was fading. China was getting rich through its revisionist market reform led by comrade Deng Xiaoping. And if the Kim regime wanted to survive the New World Order, it needed substitute relationships, new diplomatic channels, more trade routes, and above all, international recognition. It should be recognition without any economic or political reform. Reform was too dangerously a term. It was under these circumstances that our great leader came up with the idea of inviting the Pope to Pyongyang. Pyongyang did not fall in love with Catholicism. To be fair, if North Korea had to choose a type of Christianity, it would be Protestantism, just like its southern cousin. Pyongyang was once dominated by American missionaries and called the Jerusalem of the East. His Majesty himself came from a pious Protestant household. Anyhow, none of these mattered. Pyongyang didn't invite the Pope for a religious service. It was a political optics. Pope John Paul II was a global symbol. Wherever he went, the crowds gathered, cameras rolled out, and the host country looked, at least for a few days, like a respectable member of the international community. For a regime trapped in diplomatic siege, His Holiness was essentially a breakthrough strategy in white robes. But unfortunately, the Holy Father represented the Church, and the Church was a religious organization with its own concerns and priorities. Kim Il-sung ordered Foreign Minister Kim Yong-nam to take measures to invite the Pope to Pyongyang. He prayed that it might make North Korea a legitimate state, respected by one of the most powerful moral authorities in the world, and thus break its international isolation. Soon, a special task force was created inside the Foreign Ministry to prepare the project. Inside the kingdom's political institutions, the potential papal visit became a division of labor. The Foreign Ministry would handle protocol, like invitation channels, arrival procedures, schedule, interpreters, and banquet arrangements. There will be red carpets on the tarmac and motorcades escorting black Mercedes. The actual religious staff was assigned to the Workers' Party's United Front Department, whose job was to manage religious organizations and political work involving South Korea and overseas contacts. And guess who the boss of the United Front was? That's right, our dear leader Kim Jong-il. Kim Jong-il opposed the visit firmly. Oh, his revolutionary papa said it easily. A papal visit would make Pyongyang international again. But remember, Pope is a religious title, and all religions except Kim worship were banned in North Korea, with labor camps and public executions. What if the anti-communist Polish Pope, John Paul II, ignited a Catholic fanaticism? What if people start listening to the Pope instead of the Kims? The father imagined all the diplomatic benefits, but the son, who was ready to take over the country, had to manage all the internal risks. As a result, the diplomats worked 7/24, tirelessly day and night. They understood its diplomatic value and Kim Il-sung's intention. The United Front officials, however, barely moved. They sat in the office, read books and newspapers, sipping tap water and calmly wasting their time. The Foreign Ministry side noticed that their United Front colleagues were not really doing the work. Some diplomats quietly asked why, and they were told that Kim Jong-il had already killed the plan. Soon, the Foreign Ministry received the Vatican's condition. Rome wanted to meet a real North Korean Catholic. It made perfect sense, didn't it? To let the Pope visit a country, there must be Catholics in that country. The Pope doesn't go to Antarctica and hold a mass for penguins and fur seals. Officially, North Korea had religious associations like the Korean Catholic Association. They mainly existed to create an illusion that religious freedom indeed exists in the kingdom. But the Vatican wasn't cheated by a fake religious committee. It demanded a true believer. The diplomats scratched their heads, turned to each other and thought, is there any real Catholic in the country? The religious purge was real. The Korean Catholic Association and state security bureaucracy searched resident records again and again. They eventually found an elderly woman who had been recorded as Catholic before the Korean War. Cadres knocked on her door and asked whether she still believed in God. The old lady was frightened. She gave the only correct answer. How could she believe in God? Everyone here believed in the great leader and the Workers' Party. Of course she would say so. It was her survival instinct. But the officials pressed her again. They explained that they needed a genuine believer to send to the Vatican, and that finding one would help the party and the nation. Only then did she speak honestly. She said that once God enters the heart, he never leaves. Then she showed them a hidden altar behind her home, where she had prayed secretly for decades, and even her own son had no idea about it. Well, a team of bureaucrats was sent out to manufacture religious credibility, but they inadvertently discovered genuine faith. The authorities then told her she had to go to the Vatican as part of a delegation in the interests of the socialist revolution. But the old lady interpreted it differently. She looked upward, cried, and believed God had finally answered her call. The cadres immediately corrected her. It wasn't God who had called her, it was the leader and the revolution. The flight took off, and the woman went to the Vatican. There, she testified that North Koreans enjoyed religious freedom, and that families set up altars for worship, just repeating the lines that party officials told her. She met the Pope and behaved according to Catholic ritual. Reportedly, judging from her expression, the church believed she was a genuine believer. The delegation did a great job. The Vatican agreed to continue the dialogue, and the Pope might drop in anytime soon. The team got back to Pyongyang, and no flowers were awaiting them. Contacting the church created an opposite result. The Workers' Party learned that religion did not disappear, but went underground. No foreign interference, but an elderly woman could pray silently for decades inside her very private life. If one such believer existed, there must be many others. If the Pope really came, perhaps those hidden believers would feel encouraged, new believers would appear, and they together might really demand their freedom of religion. Faith in the church means unloyal to the party. So the Pope project was formally shut down. They cut the contact with the Vatican. The task force was quietly dismantled after about 2 months. The party apparatus kept its duty of deifying the Kim family, and the great leader never mentioned it again. In the end, the Pope did not come to Pyongyang. And the reason was not complicated. North Korea wanted the Vatican's recognition, but not the Vatican's religion. The Workers' Party could not tolerate any believers other than those in the Kim cult.
The compatriots from overseas expressed their thanks to the President by saying, "Respected President, on this visit to the homeland, we have felt many things and gained great strength. We believe that the greatest blessing in this world is the blessing of having a good leader."
The Pope project died in silence. Fortunately, Since Pyongyang had never announced the plan, the state never had to explain why the world's most famous Catholic did not arrive in the world's most aggressively atheist capital. The Vatican door remained closed, but another door was opening in New York. For 43 years, neither North nor South Korea had joined the United Nations. Not because the UN had forgotten Korea existed. Rather, Korea was difficult to ignore, especially after the organization had fought an entire war there. To become a UN member, a state needed a recommendation from the Security Council, where the 5 permanent members held veto power, and to be approved by the General Assembly. That was the problem. South Korea applied multiple times, but the Soviet Union and later China blocked the attempt to protect Pyongyang. North Korea's application also went nowhere because the United States and its allies viewed the DPRK not as a normal applicant, but as the aggressor state from the Korean War. Meanwhile, both countries maintained the fiction of Korean reunification, and neither wanted to enter the UN hand in hand, representing only half of the peninsula. For North Korea, the problem was even deeper. Pyongyang did not see the United Nations as a neutral global forum filled with boring diplomats, translation headsets, and long speeches about peace and order. In North Korean memory, the UN was the flag under which American-led forces had fought the Korean War. To Pyongyang, the UN was more like a paperwork department opened by the enemy army. But by 1991, the old hostility was beaten by the new practicality. The Cold War machine was breaking down. The Soviet Union was no longer willing to veto everything for Pyongyang like a loyal, exhausted, unpaid defense lawyer. Deng Xiaoping's reform era had created a new kind of socialist thinking in China, where revolutionary brotherhood remained beautiful in speeches, but trade with South Korea looked much better for economic prospects. North Korea now faced one of the most humiliating strategic questions in its post-war history. If South Korea entered the United Nations alone, what would that mean? The answer was terrifying. The so-called puppet regime, the fake Korea, the American colony in capitalist shoes, would become the only Korean representative in the world's most important international organization. The puppet would get the microphone on a global stage, while the self-declared true Korea would be left outside, shouting at the UN headquarters. What a shame. In early 1991, China delivered a message to Pyongyang. Beijing told the great leader that the situation had changed. The Northeast Asia power dynamics were shifting, and China could not allow the US to be the only major power benefiting from South Korea's rise. In other words, Moscow was unreliable, Seoul was developing fast, but China also had a procedural problem. Beijing could no longer block Seoul's UN membership and wanted to establish diplomatic ties. But abandoning the old socialist alliance and recognizing the Republic of Korea as the only Korea during the UN Assembly meeting was diplomatically embarrassing. So Beijing wanted both Koreas to join the UN, and then it could establish diplomatic relations with South Korea with elegance. North Korea would give up the claim of the whole peninsula to join the UN, and China would receive access to South Korea's economy. Sounds like a very fair plan to me. Soon afterward, the Soviet ambassador gave Pyongyang a similar message. The Soviets had already recognized South Korea, and they were no longer in a position, or in a mood, to protect any North Korean slogan at the UN meetings. The message from both old allies was essentially the same. Comrade Kim, please be rational. There is no other choice. South Korea is going to enter the UN whether you like it or not. If you decide to join at the same time, we might be able to assist. If you refuse, South Korea will enter alone, and it will be recognized by old socialist allies in any case. It's not a difficult question if you think with rationality, but it's a very tough decision for the leader's face and the Kimdom's dignity. Kim Il-sung, the father of Korean reunification, had denied South Korea's sovereignty for decades. But now his own allies were asking him to accept the very thing he had repeatedly condemned. Naturally, the great leader was furious. The sudden policy reversal would do horrible damage to his historical image. Marxism-Leninism had told him that history was marching toward reunification under socialism. But now history had arrived in the form of UN application forms, and they wanted 2 signatures. The heroic daddy worried about his historical status, but the prince had a different calculation. Socialism was dying fast. Russia and China didn't give a dime about North Korea, not because they disdained the idea of socialist monarchy, but because they were not sure if the DPRK would even exist or not by the next year. Poland implemented the capitalist shock therapy in 1989. Germany was already reunified in 1990. And looking in retrospect, the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia would soon dissolve into independent states. If North Korea rejected UN entry, South Korea might become the only Korea in the United Nations, and perhaps even absorb the North in the next few years. But if North Korea accepted the invitation, very humiliating, I know, but at least it would preserve its statehood as an equal to the South. 2 Koreas were not ideal, but 1 Korea was catastrophic. So Kim Jong-il began to persuade his father, and the great leader clearly understood the stakes. Through diplomatic channels, Pyongyang first proposed to Seoul that the 2 Koreas enter the United Nations together as one entity. Not statehood, but entity. A political Frankenstein with 2 heads of state, 2 armies, 2 constitutions, 2 capitals, and 1 shared national identity. This plan preserved the fiction of 1 Korea, while still preventing Seoul from dominating all the UN meetings. But expectedly, South Korea rejected it, and soon China rejected it too. Even Beijing was not in favor of carrying that Korean nationalist ideology through the doors of the United Nations. The only option left was perhaps to endure that disgrace. In May 1991, Malta, which held the presidency of the UN General Assembly at the time, sent Pyongyang a message. The Maltese foreign minister planned to visit North Korea and meet Kim Il-sung. But before that visit, Malta wanted to hear a final decision on the Korean membership issue. A task force was thus created inside the foreign ministry, not to make any decision, but to soften the negative impact. Kim Jong-il had already sent down the order that the great leader had accepted the plan of 2 separate entries. To take advantage of this disadvantage, North Korea bargained with Moscow and Beijing. Well, the kingdom had decided to swallow this humiliation, so if Moscow and Beijing recognize Seoul, Washington and Tokyo should also recognize Pyongyang. It's called cross-recognition. China for South Korea and the US for North Korea. The Cold War was gone, old enemies were becoming new friends, and nobody would lose face. The Foreign Ministry's actual task was to make sure China and the Soviet Union helped North Korea establish relations with the capitalist camp. On May 27th, North Korea announced that the 2 Koreas would join the United Nations simultaneously. Now, who would submit the application first? If North Korea submitted it first, it would contradict everything it had said for decades. The regime had taught its people that simultaneous UN membership would permanently divide the nation. And to do so, Kim Il-sung would become the culprit of the permanent Korean separation. But if South Korea applied first, the United States might block North Korea's application afterward. The Soviet brother wasn't helping Pyongyang, but the American was clearly supporting Seoul. Pyongyang, again, consulted China and the Soviet Union to see if there was any workaround. The Soviet ambassador said that, though Washington supported the simultaneous entry, it had not provided firm guarantees. But the Soviet Union, which held the same veto power, pledged its word and promised that it would accept South Korea's entry only if the US first accepted North Korea's entry. It meant that North Korea must apply first. Yes, the Kingdom had spent decades denouncing 2 Korean seats as national betrayal, and now its diplomats were rushing to New York City to be the first applicant. Ideology mattered, until it became a matter of life and death. In July 1991, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea submitted its UN membership application before the Republic of Korea. That move surprised both Washington and Seoul. Apparently, the North had never been this flexible before. In August, the issue passed through the UN Security Council and went to the General Assembly. And on September 17, 1991, both Koreas formally entered the United Nations. The international community celebrated the moment. South Korea welcomed it as a major diplomatic victory. But the North Korean state television only broadcast it briefly, saying the government had no alternative but to apply for separate membership because South Korea had created a crisis by seeking its own seat first. You know, when forced into a retreat, just call it enemy provocation. This was the 5th phase of North Korea's reunification strategy, or perhaps the first phase of the Korean national divorce. The next problem was how to explain it. Although the 2 Koreas now sat in the same UN meeting room, there was no prior political agreement defining their relationship. No peace treaty, only an armistice from almost 40 years ago. Were they 2 rival regimes of the same national body? Or were they diplomatic neighbor sharing one peninsula? So, in December 1991, North and South Korea signed the Agreement on Reconciliation, Non-Aggression, and Exchanges and Cooperation, better known as the Inter-Korean Basic Agreement. It was just a language trick, describing their relationship as a special relationship, temporarily bonded in the process of reunification. Separate but temporary, sovereign but 2 governments, enemies but still family, frenemies, I guess I should say. The basic agreement was, in some ways, medicine prescribed after the patient had already died. At least it saved the great leader's face. It said that simultaneous UN membership did not mean permanent division, just another temporary arrangement on the road to reunification. So, Kim Il-sung wouldn't be blamed for dividing Korea. Everything was settled, and China got its hand on, preparing to recognize Seoul. Wait, do you still remember that compensation offer? The Soviet Union said to help Pyongyang gain cross-recognition with the Western world. It turned out that the Kims were being tricked. Diplomatic recognition from Washington and Tokyo never arrived, because in the same month when the basic agreement was signed, the Soviet Union officially collapsed. Absolutely theatrical. The paperwork was left unfinished, and to this day, Japan and America have never formally recognized North Korea. By the end of 1991, North Korea stood in the ruins of its old socialist world, still shouting about reunification, while history quietly declared Seoul's victory.
The guiding ideology and theory of the Workers' Party of Korea, which gives priority to ideological work and arouses the popular masses to creative endeavors, are the secret for advancing the socialist economy and effecting its leap forward in spite of the imperialists' malicious economic blockade.
The cross-recognition plan failed. Moscow and Beijing basically treated Pyongyang as a disposable burden. 2 Koreas have become a dire reality, and now North Korea could only rely on the principle of Juche and contact the Western world by itself to survive. Good news arrived unexpectedly from Italy. In November 1992, the Italian government proposed sending its ambassador in Beijing, Oliviero Rossi, and an Asia Affairs official named Pini to Pyongyang to discuss ways to improve bilateral relations. Waves of excitement soon swept across the Kumsusan Palace. Italy, of course, was not as important as the US and Japan, but was a G7 country, a major European state, and a place with political traditions that looked, from Pyongyang's perspective, less hostile than anywhere else in the capitalist world. There were powerful socialist and communist currents in its parliament, which probably spoke some kind words for the socialist career. Rome also hosted the Food and Agriculture Organization, which mattered greatly to a country already sliding toward food disaster. Italy thus appeared to Pyongyang as a crack in the Western diplomatic blockage. The Foreign Ministry prepared a report for the leaders with a very kind of optimism. Yes, the Socialist brothers were moving away from Pyongyang. But, still remember the idea of Juche? Precisely because Moscow was gone and China turned to Seoul, North Korea could finally prove its independence. The new situation would actually strengthen North Korea's international status. From now on, Pyongyang would dress like a normal country and develop its own bilateral relations with Europe, Africa, Latin America, and eventually the imperialist USA. Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il approved the plan. Both were very pleased. In the new era of two Koreas, at least the world would recognize North Korea as an equal. The daddy decided to greet the Italian ambassador in person, while the son, equally excited, had his plans. Kim Jong-il, ever the art master, thought about theatrical staging. To smooth the deal, the Italian delegation had to be impressed. They would receive the finest cars, be served the finest meals, and only stay in the top-floor penthouse of the Koryo Hotel. There shall be a special art performance, not at an ordinary theatre, but at Mokrang 1, the Central Committee's state guest house. The People's Republic ought to show its high culture, its particular socialist art tastes. So, what about the Pochombo Electronic Ensemble and the Wangjaesan art troupe? Then, it's time to humble brag about the kingdom's wealth. The guests shall visit the Muncheon smelting facility in Gangwon province to see North Korea's gold bullion storage. This gold facility was connected to Bureau 39, the secretive financial apparatus used to generate hard currency for the leadership. These gold bars were basically the regime's entire liquidity. It was the shiny, heavy version of its international purchasing power. So when those Italian eyes got blinded by the gold bar bling, there must be a trade deal signed. Oh no, hold on a sec. One practical problem. The roads to the smelting facility were terrible. What to do? Kim Jong-il said, "Why not just take the delegation there by helicopter?" The route to the showcase was hidden. Kang Sok-ju, the powerful first vice foreign minister, was assigned to manage the delegation. A little bit of personal background. Kang had recently been punished due to a censorship review. He had been sent to a re-education farm near Pyongyang, where he cleaned pig excrement for 3 months. So now, Kang had to show enthusiasm. Not ordinary enthusiasm, but career-saving enthusiasm. He convened a meeting before the Italian delegation arrived. His instructions were intense. The visit mattered deeply to both Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. Every detail mattered. The delegation's movements, feelings, hobbies, family relations, personal impressions, all and everything had to be observed and reported. The diplomats and interpreters were essentially tasked to do the psychoanalyses of the Italians. And the most important caveat was the reporting chain. Everything had to be reported first to Kim Jong-il. Only after that would Kim Jong-il report to Kim Il-sung. Sound and clear. Time to execute. When the Italian delegation arrived, the North Koreans immediately began collecting useful personal details. From the chit-chats during the airport pickup, the ambassador's wife turned out not to be Italian, but Egyptian. More importantly, her family was related to Boutros Boutros Ghali, the UN Secretary-General at the time. It's good news. Boutros Ghali was seen as relatively independent from Washington, and knowing its relative might help later negotiations. Then came Mario Pini, the Asia Affairs specialist who turned out to speak some Korean. They found out that Pini was an Asian specialist because his wife was Asian. Well, to be specific, he learned Korean from his Korean wife. Not a North Korean wife, but a South Korean wife. He even met the South Korean ambassador in Rome before coming to Pyongyang, and he had agreed to share the diplomatic results with Seoul. The visitor's wife came from the capitalist South. It turned the two Kims down. In Pyongyang's political imagination, personal relationships were never just personal. A wife, a cousin, a language skill, everything could become leverage or ideological contamination. The Ambassador Rossi's wife, being related to the UN Secretary-General, was useful. Pini's wife, being South Korean, was suspicious. Still, the visit had to continue. The Kimdom had prepared a perfectly normal costume. 2 days later, Kim Il-sung personally met the Italian delegation, a major political gesture for Pyongyang. The son of the nation, with a busy schedule, took his precious time to receive a foreign delegation. Kim Il-sung delivered the message Pyongyang wanted Italy to hear. The Cold War was over. North and South Korea had both entered the UN. Therefore, it was time for Italy and North Korea to move beyond bloc mentality and establish diplomatic relations. However, the Italians were not there to admire North Korea's new diplomatic vocabulary. The Italian ambassador answered politely but directly. Before building diplomatic ties, Pyongyang had to resolve suspicions around its nuclear program, either through the International Atomic Energy Agency or through talks with the United States. It was kind of rude. Pyongyang had prepared nice rooms, luxury cars, and national banquets. But the Italians only got the International Atomic Energy Agency. This Western concern was, however, very real. By 1992, North Korea's nuclear issue was no longer a distant rumor. The country had signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but the implementation of inspections was never successful. North Korea suspiciously had extracted more plutonium than it had declared, and it was unverifiable. Yes, North Korea had the right to be treated like a normal state, but before everything, it should act like a normal state and forfeit its nuclear project. The meeting with Kim Il-sung did not go very well. The Italian side remained cautious. Still, the schedule continued. The next day, the Italians were taken to the Muncheon smelting facility by helicopter. The helicopter landed at the facility, and almost all of them stopped working to witness the helicopter landing that they had never seen before. The factory manager guided the delegation through the facility. He explained how gold and zinc were produced and showed the process of making gold bullion by pouring gold into crucibles. The showcase worked. The Ambassador Rossi joked that he wanted 1 piece of gold bullion. Before the interpreter answered, Kim Hyung-rim, the head of the Foreign Ministry's European Department, replied with a smile. If Italy established diplomatic relations with North Korea, they would give him 10 pieces. Everyone laughed. A small joke, a little charm. For 1 second, North Korea almost looked like a country conducting normal diplomatic hospitality. The schedule had now moved to the supposed grand finale, the gold bullion storage facility, North Korea's abundant gold reserves. The only problem was that there was no gold in storage. The facility manager sent the delegation team back to Pyongyang and secretly explained the situation to the foreign ministry. All the gold produced here was immediately sent to Pyongyang. The gold bar shown to the delegation had been made specially for their visit, since the actual production had been stopped for a while. If we could produce gold bullion every day like today, would our country be in such difficulty? That line killed the entire performance. It was just the blunt reality that North Korea was a poor dictatorship on the brink of national bankruptcy. The Italian team was puzzled. Did they take the helicopter trip just to learn about metallurgy? To be fair, no gold bar could rescue North Korea from its medieval court. People needed a strong, advanced industrial state, not a monarchy full of lies and corruption, not knowing how many gold bars were in its reserve. That evening, however, the state still had one more performance. The delegation was taken to the Central Committee's State Guest House, the sacred political theatre of the Workers' Party. Kang Sok-ju was already there, along with party cadres and the cabinet. The Italian guests were seated carefully. Pretty young women were placed beside the guests to pour drinks and keep the party mood. The instruction from above was clear. Kim Jong-il would be watching through closed-circuit television. The atmosphere had to show confidence, elegance, and hospitality. The food arrived. The carefully selected, beautiful waitresses poured the wine. Then the music began. At first, the performance was safe. Patriotic songs, proper revolutionary culture. Then the mood changed. The Pochombo Electronic Ensemble and the Wangjae-san Light Music Band shifted into jazz and disco. The lights dimmed into neon. Dancers appeared in surprisingly revealing clothing. The performance became something you would expect from a private nightclub instead of the headquarters of the Workers' Party. The Workers' Party had spent decades denouncing capitalist culture as corrupt, decadent, and morally evil. Citizens were warned about rotten bourgeois lifestyles, immoral dances, ideological pollution, and the spiritual sewage of capitalism. But apparently, when important guests came, spiritual sewage might be a good thing. The ambassador liked it. He went along with the mood, clapped, laughed, and danced with his wife when invited. Peony, however, scowled. He sat stiffly, visibly uncomfortable. A young woman repeatedly invited him to dance, and even the ambassador encouraged him. Then, Peony said the sentence that froze the room. "I am uncomfortable because I am not accustomed to being at a Giseng party." A Giseng party. The phrase dropped like an A-bomb. Everyone understood what it meant. It referred to the licentious parties that Korean female artists and courtesans entertained the royal court. The banquet, in Peony's eyes, was not dignified diplomatic hospitality, but something closer to a pleasure squad performance. Worse, Peony said it clearly enough that the Korean speakers in the room could understand. If Kim Jong-il heard that an Italian official had compared his carefully arranged banquet to a Giseng party, someone might get killed. So no one answered, and everybody pretended not to hear. Kang Sok-ju and Kim Hung-rim continued talking with the ambassador. The music continued. The flowers were still handed to the performers. The evening moved forward. After the banquet, the officials returned to the Foreign Ministry and wrote the report. It was a magnificent report. Everything went well, everyone was pleased. Italians loved North Korea's artistic culture, and they said the performance was better than Italy's. And so the Italian visit ended. The delegation, luckily for the North Korean side, did not tell the foreign media about the decadent performance. The nuclear issue was still serious, and Italy was not ready to recognize North Korea. Within months, the situation worsened. In March 1993, North Korea announced its intention to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, triggering the first North Korean nuclear crisis. Any hope of a quick Italian breakthrough disappeared. The Italian experiment failed. But you know, you'll never know if you don't try. In those disorienting years immediately following the collapse of the Cold War, the Hermit Kingdom attempted something truly unnatural. It tried to put on a tailored suit and play the role of a normal country. But the New World Order wasn't built on socialist brotherhood and reliable Soviet vetoes. Diplomacy was built on treaties, trade networks, and international law. And here, Pyongyang hit a fundamental ideological wall. You cannot harvest the Vatican's holy aura while actively banning the Bible. You cannot claim a seat at the United Nations while sending disloyal citizens to medieval labor camps. And you certainly cannot fake a functioning economy by flying Italian diplomats in a helicopter over unpaved roads to witness a staged, empty gold vault. This was the deeper tragedy of the early 1990s. Pyongyang understood that the world had changed, but it completely misunderstood what the new world demanded. The Kim dynasty thought international legitimacy was just a matter of theatrical staging. A red carpet, a polite handshake, some fake Catholics weeping on cue, and they could keep their dynastic dictatorship forever. But the post-Soviet world didn't just want photographs. The West had questions. Where are your political prisoners? Why are your people starving? And what exactly are you building in those undeclared facilities in Yongbyon? Instead of answering those questions, the regime slammed the door and threw a geopolitical temper tantrum. The Kims never truly cared about international integration, nor did they care about the romantic national tango of reunification. They only cared about enjoying unchecked power and being worshipped as living gods. The foreign visits and diplomatic overtures were nothing more than highly controlled exposure for a house that was actively burning to the ground. Ultimately, the regime settled on a brutal new survival formula. Accept just enough reality to remain alive, but deny just enough reality to remain in power. The immediate result of that equation was a famine of unfathomable human catastrophe. To survive the coming decades, the regime would have to pivot to a much darker strategy. They were about to discover a profound flaw in the Western democratic psyche. The dear leader realized that the international community doesn't just reward good behavior, but the West would pay double to avoid a nuclear war. The days of staging pathetic diplomatic theater were ending. Soon, the kingdom would stop asking for recognition and start demanding it at gunpoint. They would find a wealthy, idealistic neighbor eager to fund their survival, and they would use that very generosity to forge the ultimate radioactive insurance policy in secret. The mask was coming off. The era of atomic extortion was just beginning.